access to medicine story, or mental health medication for refugees. Our final plenary of the day will be a fantastic discussion focusing on the COVID-19 vaccine. We'll be looking at the ways that we can achieve equitable access. Also, if you want to engage with access to medicines in a more relaxed environment, join us this evening for a social packed with adventure, intrigue, and fun discussion. Throughout the day, we'll be having coffee breaks and lunch breaks with breakout rooms for any networking, or if you want to come chat to us. We're really lucky to have our speakers today join us in these breakout rooms, and we'll be going into more detail about how you can join these later on.
So hopefully you've all been keeping up to date with our social media, where you can see that today is the last day to enter into our vaccine plushie giveaway competition. This is part of a campaign we're running alongside this conference, which you'll be hearing more about throughout the weekend. The lucky winners are going to be announced tomorrow after our campaign training session, so make sure you head over to our Instagram at uam.kcl to see if you can find the vaccine emoji in one of our posts. The link I'm going to post in the chat right now will take you to a post that explains how to take part in this giveaway, so make sure you get commenting and sharing with your friends.
Amazing, super exciting. We're very, very excited to hear who actually wins. So a little reminder from us, we have a fantastic team on hand. So if you need Zoom links or want to come message us separately, our social media is on the screen. We also have our email address that will pop in the chat just in case you get lost from Zoom. This plenary link, so the link that you're in right now, will be open throughout the whole day. So if worse comes to worse, do come back here and we can direct you to what's happening. Finally, we hope by the end of this conference, you'll feel motivated and ready to get involved in advocating for equitable access to medicines. So do please ask questions, share your opinions, and get stuck in. Make sure to share your experience on social media by tagging us and using #PriceOfLife2021. We'd now like to hand over to Shirley, one of our lovely content coordinators, who will be sharing our first plenary of the weekend, Key Issues in Access to Medicines. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can everybody see me and hear me? I feel like that'll be the, okay, great. So my name is Shirley. I'm a third year Global Health and Social Medicine student, and I will be the moderator / facilitator for this morning's plenary focused on key issues in access to medicine. The intent of our session today is to cover the basis and set the tone for our conference. And we've chosen some fantastic speakers to help us achieve this. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Because there's so many of us, we have to write our questions on the chat. And I'll be reading them out loud, and I'll do my best to cover as many questions as possible. But do not worry, we came up with this great idea of making a Padlet where the speakers are able to get the link and they will be able to answer the questions there. And you don't have to worry about putting your questions there yourself. We even have someone at the end that will go through all the questions in the chat and put them on a Padlet. Furthermore, I know you guys have many COVID-19 related questions, but we advise you to save these for the next plenary and instead focus on trying to understand what really is the basis in accessing medicines and its issues. So today's plenary will be 3 mini presentations and it will be followed by a Q&A session. And to get us started, we have Saoirse Fitzpatrick, an advocacy worker at STOPAIDS, who focuses her work on increasing public awareness about key issues in access, as well as advocacy, and she's also a member of the EU Alliance for Responsible Research and Development. Over to you, Saoirse. Oh, I can't hear you yet. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Shirley, and thank you, Aisha and Rebecca. I will just share my screen. Okay, everyone see that okay? Great. So yeah, good morning. I'm really happy to be here. As Shirley said, my name is Saoirse Fitzpatrick and I'm the Advocacy Manager at STOPAIDS. We are a network of 70 NGOs and social justice organisations based in the UK, but working on the global HIV response and other global health related issues. And part of what we do is convene the Missing Medicines Coalition, which is a group of some of our members and also patient organisations. And collectively, we aim to challenge the structural barriers that prevent people from accessing the medicines that they need at prices that they can afford. And yeah, I started my professional career coordinating what is now STOPAIDS. Many of you may have come across STOPAIDS. But it means that I'm a true believer. I know the power of student activism, and I'm so impressed that you are all giving up your weekend to learn and to organize and to try and improve this situation in global health equity. So yeah, I've worked on access to medicines for about 8 years all in all. And I mean, it's been a very difficult and chaotic year for all of us to varying degrees, obviously with the pandemic. But for us who've been working on access to medicines for a long time, for this issue now to be, the issue of the moment in terms of establishing equity and access to the COVID-19 vaccines and the other tools, it has been, a year on turbocharge. And I know you're going to hear a lot more about the COVID response and access issues within that later on. So I'm going to focus on giving you an overview of the access to medicines fight and the movement itself, and talk you through some of the longer term solutions that the Missing Medicines Coalition is working towards. And just a small caveat, I have 2 young sons and their dad is trying to get them out of the house. But apologies for any background noise in the beginning. Great, so I'll begin with just sort of unpacking what we mean when we're talking about access to medicines. So it has its roots in human rights, and essentially we're trying to aim for every person to be able to access the medicines and medical technologies that they need to allow them to realize the highest attainable standard of health. And it's really helpful that this is a human right, not only because obviously health is essential to our existence, but also from a campaigning and an advocacy point of view. When we're campaigning and advocating to the UK government for universal access to medicines, we always refer back to the fact that this is enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights and various other documents, and that they are a signee of that. Most countries are. So it gives us a basis to kind of base all our advocacy asks upon. So in terms of like the scale of the problem, when we're talking about access to medicines, it's roughly estimated that about 2 billion people globally cannot access the medicines that they need. But as we will see in this presentation later on, the human impact of our current model for developing medicines is, the implications of that are much wider. For instance, many people may have access to medicine, but it might be older medicine, which is less effective. It has higher toxicity, it has higher side effects, and they may not be able to access newer versions of those medicines because they are too expensive, or in other cases, they simply might not exist. So there are many barriers to people accessing medicines, and rather than sort of just giving you a long list, I thought I'd begin with giving an overview of a case study that will introduce some of those barriers. So as I said, I work for STOPAIDS, and we work on the international HIV response, and we've been around since 1986. And at that time, if you were given a positive HIV diagnosis, there was no effective treatment. It was effectively a death sentence. Then in the late 1990s, the first antiretrovirals came onto the market, and the first combination of 3 drugs that was antiretroviral therapy that proved very effective in treating HIV. And it was heralded as a huge success. But that treatment cost around $12,000 per person per year. And this was just completely unaffordable for the majority of the world's health systems and individuals, and obviously particularly in lower middle income countries. So why were the drugs priced so high? Well, because they were under patent protection. So that means that the companies who made them hold a monopoly over them. And as a result of that monopoly, they are the only ones who can produce that drug. With nobody else producing it, no competition, there's nothing to drive that price down. So companies can just charge whatever they want. And that's what they did. And that's what they continue to do. And these rules around patents, around intellectual property, they come from the World Trade Organization and from a particular piece of legislation called the TRIPS Agreement, the Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, which I think Dr. Olga is going to speak about later on. So I won't go into any more depth than that at this point. But yeah, we had this situation where there's drugs available, but but the majority of people can't afford them. And it was an utterly shameful situation. It was a crisis that held greed and racism at its core, but it gave birth to a movement. And this photo is of a demo in South Africa, organized by Treatment Action Campaign, who are an incredible campaigning group. And along with other networks and campaigning groups in other lower middle income countries and high income countries too, this story around the inequity in accessing HIV treatment really came to the global stage, along with the fact that in 1998, Nelson Mandela tried to change some South African laws to allow it to enable accessing more affordable medicine to be easier. And as a result of that proposal to change that law, he was sued by 39 multinational pharmaceutical companies. So that also really helped put it into the global consciousness. As a result of all this kind of movement around the inequity in accessing HIV treatment, there was a group of activists who got together and were thinking through who and what company they could ask to see if it was possible to make a generic version of the antiretroviral treatment. So a completely copycat version, which would have to reach exactly the same quality standards as the originator drug, but it just doesn't have the brand name. So it can be produced as a fraction of the price. And they got hold of this company in India called Cipla, run by Dr. Hamid, and they asked, can you make the drugs? And he said yes. They had been making some antiretrovirals before this point, and they asked how much, and he said that they could do it for $365 a year, as opposed to $12,000 a year. So that was a symbolic $1 a day treatment. And so that happened in 2001. And that year as well, because it was a PR story that was just too powerful even for Big Pharma to fight against, those 39 multinational pharmaceutical companies also dropped their case against Nelson Mandela. And in the beginning of the 2000s, there was this huge jump in access to medicines, access to treatment for HIV, sorry. And then since then, we've had lots of new antiretrovirals come into the market. And as STOPAIDS and as the MSF Access Campaign and International Treatment Preparedness Coalition and many other organizations, every time a new antiretroviral came onto the market, there would be this big fight for a generic version to be made. Campaigners, including us, also pushed for the establishment of the Médecins patent pool, which is an initiative that allows pharmaceutical companies to pool to share their patents to improve access in lower middle income countries, which I think Dr. Olga will also speak to. So there was a precedent set with the success in the Cipla case of getting these first antiretrovirals at such a low cost. But the fight was far from over. And there was a realization that drug prices across the board, not just for HIV treatments, for TB treatments, for cancer, for cystic fibrosis, for everything, they were just getting higher and higher and higher and becoming more unaffordable, not only for lower middle income countries, but for high income countries too. And this is just a couple of clippings from newspapers that kind of capture some of those cases where drugs have just been too expensive for the NHS, too expensive for across the world. And here are some specific examples for the NHS. So you may remember just 3 years ago, this long fight to get the cystic fibrosis drug Orkambi at an affordable price for the NHS. And it took 3 years of negotiations to get that price down. There was also a similar case for Kadcyla, the breast cancer drug. And this top right-hand corner here, this is a great activist group called Just Treatment, who are part of the Missing Medicines Coalition, who campaigned for to really kind of show like the issue here was not about the NHS not being at fault in that they weren't, kind of saying that they could pay for these drugs, but actually like, why are these drugs being priced so high in the first place, and putting the onus much more on the pharmaceutical company. In the last 4 years, the NHS has had to ration hepatitis C treatment because it was too expensive. It originally came out as $1,000 per pill. And there have been many reports across civil society, but also the King's Fund, on what the situation is with the rising cost of medicine. But it's important to say that high prices are only one problem in our current medical innovation system that affect access. Another really big issue is around the fact that because profit is the driver of this system, and it also drives the research agenda. And as a result of that, diseases that don't affect wealthy markets do not get prioritized. So this is just an image to illustrate neglected tropical diseases, which are the kind of problem is in the name. Like, they are neglected for a reason. It's because they predominantly affect lower middle income countries. And despite them affecting 1.7 billion people globally, in a 11-year period, between 2000 and 2011, only 4% of new drugs coming to the market were actually for NTDs. And funding for NTDs for research is actually decreasing. It's decreased by 10% over the last decade. And this profit-driven agenda is also the same reason why we don't have antibiotics. New antibiotics are not coming to market. There's just not that financial incentive to make them, because there will be this curtailment in how they're prescribed. And as a result, the volume won't be as big. So pharmaceutical companies are reluctant to prioritize their research and development. So money isn't going into public health needs. So where is it going? So one area that it's going into is something called Me Too drugs. So while these critical public health needs remain unmet, actually the majority of new medicines developed don't have any added therapeutic value compared to what's already on the market. So in Europe, they analyzed 13,000 new medicines for approval between 2000 and 2014. And they revealed that over 50% of those medicines were just like modified versions of existing drugs. And this image here is from the German Health Technology Assessment Agency, which came to a similar conclusion. So these drugs are known as Me Too because they're similar to existing drugs, but they are different enough to be considered novel. And if you have an invention which can be considered novel, then you can patent it. So that really, highlights how like the incentives that we have for innovation to award patents as a way of saying to companies that if you can hold a monopoly, you'll be able to recoup your R&D investment, aren't good for public health. There's nothing within a patent that says that something that you're producing, some new invention that you have, has to have public health value, has to have that added therapeutic value. Another area where money is going is also into just sort of financialized practices like buying back shares. So this is a really common process where companies buy back their own shares in order to increase their scarcity and therefore increase their value, and then boost the dividend payouts. But for pharmaceutical companies who are supposed to be producing, essential health products, it really shows just how kind of warped the system is. And this is a stat from a report that we did called The People's Prescription with an economist called Mariana Mazzucato. And yeah, it showed in the last decade, Pfizer has spent 139 billion on share buybacks and dividends compared to 82 billion on R&D. So you can see now how the incentives that we have within the system are channeling money into practices that aren't responding to public health needs. And this is all in a situation where actually the public are fronting a lot of that bill for R&D. So we did a report called Pills and Profits, and it showed that in 2016 and 2017, and I'm sure if we did the numbers again, it would show for like all the years since then, that the NHS spent £1 billion purchasing medicines that had received public investment. And globally, some estimate that the public pays for between 1 to 2/3 of upfront drug R&D costs. So you may have heard of this narrative of the public paying twice, and it's true. You know, you're paying through your taxes, and then again through taxes paying for that treatment when it's bought by the NHS. So you're paying for the R&D, and then you're paying for buying it through the NHS. So the way it kind of commonly works is that, you know, governments are funding universities or small biotech companies who do that initial bit of research, that really risky bit of research where there's no you know, you're going from nothing in order to try and investigate whether like a particular compound will work. And once it's been suitably de-risked, that's when a bigger pharmaceutical company will come in, they will buy the technology. Then usually they will do the clinical trials themselves, but often they will just contract out the clinical trials, and then they often contract out the manufacturing as well. So essentially, like, they're very good project managers, these multinational pharmaceutical companies. I just got an example. So this is for the hepatitis C treatment that I mentioned earlier on, Sovaldi. And this is basically its story from like the very beginning, when it was first identified in 1989, how, then it went on to get funding from the NIH in the US, the National Institute of Health, 2002. It got some other funding from in the US as part of like a small medium enterprise initiative. Then Pharmasset, who are a biotech company, developed it, and you know, it became known as Sofosbuvir. It got some other public money from the UK MRC and also the European Commission, the Belgian government. Then Gilead acquire, they just buy Pharmasset for 11 billion. They get their approval for the drug, and then it comes to market. And this was in, I mean, their revenues must be much higher than this now. But they originally costed that drug at $1,000 a pill. And that's one of the reasons it was rationed on the NHS. So we didn't pay that much, but still the price was too high for the NHS to be able to afford to treat everybody who needed the treatment. So I've just given a long list of problems. And ultimately what this all highlights is that our current model for medical innovation, it needs a lot of work in order for it to have stronger public value, in order for it to be responding to public health needs effectively. And that's what we're trying to do within the Missing Medicines Coalition. We're trying to fight to improve the current model, but we're also trying to push governments to explore new ways of incentivizing innovation, new models for innovation. And one of the things that we push for, we do this through advocacy. So through speaking to MPs and trying to create political pressure, also through mobilizing the public and having public facing actions. And then we also speak a lot to civil servants and try with them to make the technical case for why it makes sense from a UK government perspective to support universal access to medicines. And one of the things that we're pushing for is greater public control and greater public return on public investment. And this is like this key one here, point one here, and making sure that public health needs are driving innovation. The other thing we want to see is greater collaboration and transparency of the whole system, because the whole system is completely opaque. We don't really know how much is spent on R&D. We don't know how much governments are paying for drugs. Affordability and access, obviously, and then longer term horizons. So it's not so kind of short term focused, and because the short termism is what kind of leads to these sort of financialized practices. So this is what we want in a future model, on how we can, and sort of presents us like the guidelines for how we improve the current model. So in terms of like the public return on public investment, we push for conditions within the contracts that the government award to universities or to small biotech companies. And within those conditions, we want there to be principles around access and affordability, transparency, sharing knowledge, and also reinvestment, meaning like that if there are any royalties made from a drug, that they would be reinvested back into R&D. And I guess most importantly here, or maybe just to give an example, like if the UK government had set these conditions when they were awarding money to Oxford over the years, for instance, for like the COVID-19 research, then perhaps one of those conditions could have been that Oxford University would not exclusively license the vaccine to AstraZeneca. They could have openly licensed it, which is what they actually originally intended to do. But because of pressure from the government and also from the Gates Foundation, they did end up exclusively licensing it to AstraZeneca. And then the other thing that we push for are new incentives, and we push for a model called delinkage, where basically you have R&D happening, but you delink it from the incentive of being awarded with a monopoly at the end, because the monopoly is what leads to the high price. And by changing the incentives, we can also determine what kind of health innovation happens, and we can make sure that public health comes first. So basically, like, delinkage is an innovation model where you're still rewarding the innovation, but rather than giving a monopoly, you are giving a financial return. It's the government giving a financial return, and it could be in the form of research subsidies, or it could be in the form of milestone prizes, for instance, like if when a drug gets up to clinical stage, phase 1, for instance, then there would be a payout. When it gets to phase 3, there would be another payout. And these incentives and the kind of innovation that they reward could be completely decided by the government. The government can say, it's like putting something out to tender, essentially, like, we have this amount of money and we would like to produce some new antibiotics. And then they can say, okay, we will give you this money in order to kind of start the R&D process, and then there will be these prizes along the way. And as a result of the organizations, whether they're multinational pharmaceutical companies, universities, biotech companies taking part in this process, part of the condition for that is that there is no exclusive license at the end of this process. There could still be a patent in order for just kind of ascerning authorship of a product at the end of it. But the conditions within using this delinkage model is that that patent is not attached to an exclusive license. So it would always be on the basis that you may hold a patent, but it will always be openly licensed. And therefore you're taking the sting out of the patent. The patent itself isn't the problem. It's like the exclusivity, which makes everything very, very complicated and creates the privatization of knowledge and creates the high prices. So we did a little bit of kind of modeling to see like how much the UK government could save using a delinkage model. And we worked out that we only had primary care figures. So actually they're a little bit conservative, these figures. But we worked out that the NHS drug procurement bill for primary care products could be reduced from 8.5 billion to 4.3 billion per year. So yeah, roughly half. And we also worked out that as a result of this saving, the UK government could then have more money to put back into R&D. Because in this delinkage model, without there being a patent at the end and without there being a high price and without there being this exclusive license, it means that any company can produce that product at the end. You can have lots of generic competition, and that is the most sustainable way of driving the price down. So with buying drugs through this delinkage model, the UK government would make this large saving, which could then be reinvested back into R&D. And we worked out that UK government's current R&D funding is around 2.4 billion, and it could be increased to 6.6 billion, which is even higher than the how much is spent by pharma in the UK in a year, which is around 4.3 billion. So it's about 2 billion more than that. So it's a really promising way of creating incentives that will mean that we can produce the drugs and the health technologies that people need at prices that they can afford. And what we were pushing for before COVID came along was that the UK government would pilot a delinkage model. And we're going to have a campaign around that very soon. But I just wanted to leave you with a campaign action, which is based on what we're working on at the moment, which is, of course, equity in the COVID-19 response. And we have an action which is calling on the UK government to support this proposal at the World Trade Organization from the South African and Indian governments to waive that TRIPS agreement that I mentioned earlier and that Dr. Olga, I'm sure, is going to talk about next. By waiving this agreement, we can get rid of those intellectual property barriers within the COVID response, and it would mean that lots of manufacturers could begin to make the vaccines, the diagnostics, the treatments. As a result, we wouldn't have this monopolizing situation that we have at the moment, where high-income countries are absorbing all the vaccines, all the manufacturing capacity and the supply chains, and you'd be able to have local and regional manufacturing happening in lower and middle income countries and be able to increase the supply of all these products. And that would really help in improving equity to the vaccines and the other tools. So if you go to the missingmedicines.org site /take action, you can see the action there. And yeah, it'd be great if everybody could take 5 minutes to write to your MP and call on them to urge the UK government to support the waiver. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Saoirse. That was very insightful, particularly the delinkage model. And now we have Dr. Olga, whose research is focused on the intersection between patents, competition law, and access to affordable medicines. Currently, she's exploring the role of intellectual property in the development of and access to COVID-19 medicines.
Thank you very much, Shirley, for introducing me. Thank you for inviting as well. And Saoirse did a great job of providing a very good introduction to the problem and overview of all the issues that we are experiencing today and have been experiencing for the last several decades. And with my presentation, let me share now. We will look deeply into into the roots, into the problems of all these issues that were discussed in the beginning. So in this session, we will talk about, just one second, I will switch to the next slide. So in this session, we'll talk about patents. What are patents, why they are important, and we'll focus obviously on the pharmaceutical industry, and we will also talk about the intersection between patents and access to medicines. We will discuss what is the TRIPS agreement, and in the end, I will mention a few words about the medicines patent pool. So in order to understand the roots of the problem, we need to understand what is a patent, right? So patents are granted by the state for the protection of new inventions. And you can get a patent for a product or a process. And such inventions must meet certain patentability requirements, right? Not everything that is invented can be patented. Only inventions that are new, that have inventive step, something that is not obvious to the expert in the particular field of invention, and they must be capable of industrial applicability. Patents last for 20 years, and what is important for today's session is that they give this exclusive rights over the invention, right? Meaning that only the patentee can use the invention, no one else. And if others want to use this invention, they must ask for permission. And obviously the patentee then is free to give this permission or refuse. Patents are sometimes viewed as a social contract between the inventor and society, which means that in return for patent protection, the patentee must disclose his or her invention, and this disclosure, this essentially generates public knowledge, right? And this monopoly right that is granted to the patentee induces this disclosure, and in turn then generate technological development. And also this means that this is a very important function of the patent system, and it is traditionally viewed as an instrument to incentivize innovation, to reward innovation, and because by granting this exclusive rights or monopoly rights for the invention to the patentee has the opportunity to gain some profit, to recoup investments, sometimes very significant investments into their research, and therefore this is viewed traditionally as a tool to encourage innovation. Now, whether it is working or not, that's a different story, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. But this is a traditional view, and this is the argument that is heavily exploited by pharmaceutical industry. Now, let's talk about why patents are important, right? And a very good example is the pharmaceutical industry. So you know that this industry is very unique in its complexity. It is characterized by very heavy state regulation and sometimes by competing interests between the pharmaceutical business and society. And it also involves multiple actors. And in these complex relationships, a crucial role is designated to two key players. On the one hand, originators. They play a very important role in developing new and improved medicines for benefit of society. On the other hand, generic companies. They produce generic versions of the originators' products that patent protection of which expired. And this brings the reduction of drug prices and obviously facilitates access to medicines. And these two elements of the pharmaceutical industry are constantly interacting and have a very significant impact on each other. Right, so innovation is a very important element of pharmaceutical industry. It's a backbone of pharmaceutical industry, and originators play a key role in this area. And as you know, the process of drug development is very long, it's complicated, it requires significant investments and also bears considerable risks. And industry figures shows that only 1 out of 10,000 compounds synthesized in laboratories will eventually reach the market. They also claim, and again, this is industry figures, that the process of developing a drug from the moment of selecting a compound in laboratory, right, till the moment it reaches the market, takes on average 10-15 years and costs on average more than $2 billion. Some authors and economists say that this is much cheaper, but again, it's still a lot of money. And the process of drug development is also very heavily regulated, because in order to launch a product, originators need to obtain marketing authorization, and for these they need to show that drug is effective and safe, and in order to do that they need to conduct a lot of lengthy, expensive clinical trials. So you can see that a lot of efforts, a lot of financial investments go into developing a drug, and therefore pharmaceutical industry rely heavily on exclusivity granted by intellectual property rights, and in particular patents. As I mentioned, patents provide a 20-year monopoly right. During this period, pharmaceutical companies enjoy market exclusivity, market monopoly, and during this time they are able to charge a monopoly price for its products. And of course, originators argue that strong patent protection is essential for them in order to recoup investments and to incentivize them to engage in further innovation. And a good example of this, and this is the example that was already mentioned in the first presentation, is drug Sovaldi, and the effect of patent protection on this drug and access to this drug. So as was mentioned, Sovaldi is a treatment for hepatitis C, and in 2015, World Health Organization estimated that more than 70 million people were infected with this disease in the world. And the earlier treatment for this, for hepatitis C, was very toxic. It had very nasty side effects. So Gilead introduced an innovative drug, Sovaldi, active ingredient, sofosbuvir, and it is now used in the treatment of hepatitis C. And that was a new generation of medicines, and it offered significant gains in efficacy. It offered less side effects, and for the first time, it was a treatment that achieved cure rate over 90%. So it's a very, very good drug. The only problem with this drug is that it is very, very expensive. And it was initially charged by the company at a prohibitive price of 1,000 per pill, or 84,000 for a 12-week treatment in the US. And only in the first quarter of 2014, the company gained profit over $2 billion by selling this product, right? So obviously, such a high pricing of this life-saving medicine was only possible because the company enjoyed the monopoly on the market provided by their patent protection and market exclusivity. But once such patent protection expires, other companies may develop generics of branded drugs and start selling in competition with originators. And this is called generic competition. Generic drugs are bioequivalent version of the branded drug that lost patent protection, right? So it's the same drug, but it is a generic version and it is produced by a different company. And generic entry typically leads to, on average, 80% market share loss and a 20-30% reduction of a drug price, and sometimes it leads up to 90% of price fall. So generic competition is very, very important, and it is possible when the patent protection on brand name drugs expires. And a representative example of the effect of generic competition on the prices of originators is the Eli Lilly's blockbuster antidepressant Prozac. So Eli Lilly began to sell its blockbuster product in late 1980s, and it essentially revolutionized the treatment of depression. And it quickly became the biggest selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry at that time. But in 2001, when a patent protection on this drug expired, Eli Lilly lost 70% of its market share and more than $2 billion in annual sales. So that's a power of generic competition and competition in general that leads to accessibility and affordability of medicines. Right, so this is the system that we know today, right? But this system of medical innovation and access to medicines, as we know it today, a proprietary system of innovation, has taken shape fairly recently. In the past, many countries did not provide patent protection on medicines, or provided very limited protection to only the process of manufacturing of a medicine. And therefore, countries around the world were able to design their policies in relation to access to medicines quite freely in accordance to their local needs. And the lack of patent protection for medicines was justified by the risk of high prices on patented drugs. which would affect the accessibility and affordability of treatment. And up until 1995, drugs remained unprotected in approximately 50 countries around the world. This, however, changed in 1995 when the World Trade Organization agreement on trade-related aspects of IP rights, of intellectual property rights, the so-called TRIPS agreement, came into force. And the signing of this TRIPS agreement became a grand victory of the big pharma. And this was because they wanted strong protection for their pharmaceutical products worldwide. But before the time, as I mentioned, some countries didn't provide such protection, and that meant that on their territories, local companies were able to freely copy their products and start manufacturing. And the most famous example probably is India, in which essentially this lack of protection boosted the development of a very powerful generic pharmaceutical industry. And it still remains the pharmacy of the world, right? So obviously international pharma companies were not happy about this state of affair, and they heavily lobbied the high level of patent protection in all WTO member states. So the TRIPS agreement that came into force in 1995 finally set the so-called minimum standard of patent protection at an international level. So everyone had to have at least this minimum level of protection of higher level or high level. And they could not provide less protection because otherwise that country would violate TRIPS agreement and could face very serious repercussions. So Article 27 of the TRIPS agreement establishes these new rules, and it says that patents shall be available for any inventions in all fields of technologies. So this small phrase, all fields of technologies, brought a significant change in this field. Such a mandatory minimum standard resulted in the protection extended to all inventions, including pharmaceuticals and medicines. And therefore, as a result of this international agreement, every member state of World Trade Organization undertook an obligation to introduce patent protection for drugs in their national legislation. And these new global rules, coupled with bilateral treaties between countries, for example, developed and developing countries, that strengthen this protection even further, and also some patent-related strategies by pharmaceutical companies that are directed at evergreening of their market monopoly by filing lots of additional patents around existing medicines. So all these elements, right, TRIPS agreement, bilateral agreements, pharma strategies, this resulted in many countries not being able to provide sufficient access to medicines, to essential life-saving medicines for their populations. And such changes obviously were particularly detrimental to developing countries that could not afford the burden of pharmaceutical patents. They were simply lacking necessary financial resources to bear this cost of expensive patented medicines. As was stated in the report prepared by the UN United Nations High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines in 2016, they said that diseases such as HIV, which have become manageable chronic conditions in developed countries, continue to kill millions of people in low and middle income countries because of unaffordably high prices of patented medicines. But also, as was mentioned earlier, developed countries are increasingly suffering from high drug prices, right? So the current design and use of the patent system have contributed to creating the two major inadequacies in healthcare. On the one hand, the lack of genuine innovation, right, at a satisfactory scales, the so-called Me Too drugs that was mentioned in the first session, first presentation, and especially to address rare and neglected conditions, and unaffordable medicines for developing as well as developed countries. But nevertheless, in recent years, trying to kind of overcome this negative effect of pharmaceutical monopolies and a pressing need for affordable medicines worldwide, some organizations have been implementing alternative methods of drug development and access. And a good example is the Medecins patent pool. This is a UN-backed public health organization, which was founded in 2010, and it is based in Geneva, Switzerland. So its aim is to lower the price of HIV, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C medicines. And it is based on the idea that patents should reward innovation. And therefore, if a patent is not licensed, it can prevent the production and sale of affordable generic medicines and the development of novel medicines as we can experience now. So it partners with patent holders to license patents and pool intellectual property to encourage generic manufacture and the development of new formulations for these diseases. And these licenses then permit lower cost manufacturers to distribute patented medicines in developing countries. And since 2018, Medecins patent pool has expanded to other patented essential medicines on the WHO model list. And also last year, they temporarily expanded its mandate to include COVID-19 treatment. And the results of this work are quite impressive. So this is the information taken from their website, and through its licensing partners, Medicine Patent Pool supplied 14.5 billion doses of treatment, saving incredible amount of money, more than $1.5 billion in healthcare budgets. Right, so it's one of the mechanisms, patent pools, IP pools, that can facilitate access to affordable medicines, especially for developing countries. And of course, today we know that there is a COVID-19 technology access pool, CTAP, which was established by World Health Organization, and it calls for voluntarily sharing COVID-19 technology knowledge and intellectual property and data. But this is something that you would probably be discussing later on today and with other panels. So I'm not going to go into much detail on that. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Olga. That was very interesting. I have a lot of questions. But let us move on to our final panelist today, Dr. Yuan, a senior legal and policy advisor for Médecins Sans Frontières. Her work looks at the intersections between intellectual property, human rights, and access to medicines. And today she'll be able to give us a bit of case studies regarding this. Can you hear me? Were you guys not hearing me the whole time? Oh, you were. Apologies, technology is very difficult these days. And yeah, Dr. Hu, if you could.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work with everyone. So thanks to the previous speakers, I think many of the issues I will cover have very great overlap and with the introduction that's been made by Saoirse and Olga. So some of the issues I will be brief. The presentation would focus on MSF's work and observations on access to medicines in the past and also in the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a medical humanitarian organization, MSF have been, my kind of organization has been working on the access to medicines dimension from two levels, basically. Accessing to the existing medicines and treatment, and also the mechanism of the development and access to new medicines and treatment. So some of the key issues related to affordability, availability, and suitability of medicines, vaccines, and diagnosis developed for in developing countries context are the major concern focus of our work. So when it's come to what kind of factors may have an impact on access to medicines, previous speakers also mentioned there's many things that could have an impact on whether and how we actually have the access to medicines in the end. And my work, working as a legal and policy advisor in MSF, mainly focus on the role of monopoly that has been supported primarily by intellectual property and other market exclusivity status, and how that kind of monopoly would have an impact on the price and production supply of medicines, vaccines, and other medical tools needed. So Saoirse mentioned the example of HIV/AIDS access issues, which we totally related to, because this the slide here illustrates MSF's own experience, because we procure medicines independently and dispatch to the medical treatment program we have in different developing countries. So the slide here is illustrated our direct observation and experience when we procure medicines for HIV/AIDS treatment, how generic competition has been a critical catalyst for the price reduction and facilitated greater access in low and middle country settings. The reason why this could happen, as Olga mentioned, was before the late 1990s, when World Trade Organization agreement on trade related to intellectual property rights was introduced, many countries had more flexibility to manage patents and intellectual property on medicines. India and Brazil back then did not give patent on the compound, the product of medicine. So company could seek for patenting on different process, but then they could not patent on the substance of the medicine itself, meaning that people can find different way of making the same medicine without being held as infringing other people's intellectual property. So that made it possible for generic company in India and Brazil came into play very quickly when the first generation of HIV/AIDS medicine was introduced to the market. So when they enter into market, the price dropped dramatically and supported the availability and accessibility of more affordable versions. So as I also mentioned, the incidence of pharmaceutical companies suing South African government when South Africa was trying to introduce a new law to facilitate access to medicine. So that I wouldn't repeat. So this is what happened in late 1990s. And then in 1995, as we other speaker also mentioned, the international law actually dramatically changed with the adaptation and entry into force of the agreement of trade-related intellectual property rights. Many of the flexibilities country enjoyed before then was taken away, well as there's minimum standards that every country who wanted to join World Trade Organization to be part of the free trade multilateral system had to commit themselves to implement the TRIPS agreement, unless if the country is a least developing country, and then they have some different way of implementing. So far, the least developing countries do not have to implement pharmaceutical related IP and the TRIPS agreement until 2033. And there is another flexibility for them to not needing to implement the TRIPS agreement at all until July this year. However, this extension need to be, this timeline need to be extended, and there's ongoing process to that. So when the old flexibility were taken away, some of the new flexibilities, although very limited compared to the previous time, remain. For instance, government still can have some power when it comes to intellectual property, especially patents. There's some mechanism called composite license for government use when it comes to non-commercial use of medicine, or in the emergency or extremely urgent situation, government can override a patent rights without the consent of the holder. And then there is some limitation and exceptions when it comes to granting IP on pharmaceutical subjects. For instance, country can choose not to give patent on the method of treatment, but that is not a firm obligation, it is a choice. In reality, some countries still gave patents on method of treatment, even though as clinicians, this should be common knowledge on how to treat a patient. The method of treatment actually should be a public knowledge rather than forced within private property. So, but apart from the very limited flexibility contained in TRIPS agreement, there's other avenue that has been explored by pharmaceutical company, and to introduce higher, longer, and more type of exclusivities through the free trade agreement or bilateral investment treaties. So I wouldn't go to detail here, but some of the more like a different type of exclusivities are introduced, including exclusive protection of clinical data that has been submitted for regulatory approval. And then the very broad patentability criteria for pharmaceuticals, such as we said, the treatment, method of treatment, and second medical indication in some countries are not patentable, and which is allowed by TRIPS agreement. But then pharmaceutical company want to introduce those through free trade agreement, so that country would have less flexibility to manage public health interests. There's also asking to extend the patent protection period of time when the international law said 20 years time, and the pharmaceutical industry asked for longer. So those are a different type of strategy endorsed, kind of used by pharmaceutical company. But then if we look closer of the flexibilities, basically there could be a group of government-led mechanisms to manage the balance between public interest and pharmaceutical IP rights. and manufacturer-driven measures such as bilateral voluntary license. So previous speaker has have the overview of those. I wouldn't go to details. So one thing I want to see a little bit more is what Olga mentioned, the evergreening strategy, which is a very kind of worrisome and problematic strategy MSF have been working for a very long time with other civil society organizations to tackle. Basically, as we said, there's a new drug introduced into the market, and then if the company got patent on the original substance, they probably will have 20 years patent starting from the date of the filing. But then in order to extend the market position, company would find all different ways to extend that monopoly position through multiple patents on different aspects of the same medicine. So a company have been applying for patent on the new dosage, new formulation, different derivatives of the same old medicine, and also the new indication. If the same medicine used to treat different diseases, each indication could potentially be subject to a new patent, depending on the national law. So through those kinds of multiplied patenting strategy, some company managed to extend their market exclusivity beyond the 20 years time. So that is so-called evergreening strategy. And then many of those evergreening patents filed on the old medicines, if we look very closer from legal and technical perspective, they do not really represent innovation, because many of the technique and method used and presented in those patents are very obvious to generic companies and anyone who know how to develop medicines or use medicines in treating patients. So the previous speaker also mentioned the example of sofosbuvir for hepatitis C treatment. I wouldn't repeat that also, but one of the issues that because MSF also needing that medicine at that time for our hepatitis C treatment. One of the key issues related to hepatitis C treatment, as we say, is that it's also a combination of different type of monopolies and exclusivities, including patents and data, and very restrictive exercise of voluntary license, and lacking of registration, and the price, as we mentioned by the other speakers. So as a result, sofosbuvir is super expensive in its launching. And then we also worked with civil society organizations in different countries, analyzed what kind of patents actually attached to sofosbuvir, and identified many evergreening practice by Gilead, meaning that, as we said, some of the patent applied for by Gilead or even granted were not merited if we compare what they are claiming, what the company is claiming, against what the law requires. So many of the patents applied should not be granted in the first place. So MSF and other civil society organizations, even including in Europe, India, Brazil, Ukraine, and other countries, have been fighting challenges, legal challenges or administrative challenges to argue that the patent on sofosbuvir should be opposed or rejected. And in addition to patent, there's also other problems with sofosbuvir in terms of the exclusivity enjoyed by by Gilead. One such example happened in Ukraine when Gilead actually did not have a patent granted in Ukraine that could block generic entry. So in theory, Ukraine should be a free market, right? So companies should be able to, whether it's a Gilead or other generic company, in theory, they should be able to enter into Ukraine as long as they pass the regulatory approval process, making sure their different products are safe and quality assured. However, Ukraine was also not part of the territory covered by Gilead bilateral voluntary license, with a few generic companies, meaning that the generic company who signed a license with Gilead cannot supply Ukraine because Ukraine is not in the supply territory. But other generic company who didn't sign a license with Gilead could supply Ukraine. So in theory, this should be a kind of a quite flexible market to enter. However, Gilead, despite of having no patent in Ukraine, claimed that it should enjoy something called data exclusivity, meaning that Gilead said, I'm an investor, I'm an originator, so I should have some exclusivity in Ukrainian market. And then according to Ukrainian law, Gilead does not enjoy that status. So they were rejected. The company was rejected by the government, and then they appealed and rejected. So in theory, you know, if we say following the rule of law, and Gilead should just back off and then be a good business operating in the market. However, Gilead didn't give up, and they sued the government to the court. But after all of the court procedure, the Ukrainian court found Gilead did not have the right to enjoy that exclusivity according to the national law. So as a last resort, Gilead is threatened to launch something called investor state dispute settlement mechanism under a bilateral investment treaty between Ukraine and the US, because Gilead has some registration status in the US, to see that, okay, you didn't give me this exclusivity, but I'm a foreign investor in your country. I can have the right to sue Ukrainian government to a tribunal under this investment treaty. And then Ukrainian government was immediately frightened and then settled the deal with Gilead. So as this example actually shows that in addition to the more obvious issue of patents and IP that we could analyze through the legal lens, company also have other means to endorse and sustain their monopoly by using different tactics. So another kind of experience we had was related to vaccine. So this is very relatable if later on we talk about COVID-19 situation. So MSF has been following the access to pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, 13-valent and 10-valent access issues in developing countries for a very long time, because the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine is among the most expensive vaccines for many developing countries to procure, and the budget allocation to procure PCV has exorbitant and then occupied many countries' budget. There is no competition, no alternative version for a very, very long time. So only until last year, there is one alternative supplier from India entered after more than 10 years effort by different people. So by the time before last year, there was no alternative supplier other than Pfizer and GSK. And also Pfizer holds a very strong monopoly, and it has one patent granted in many countries concerning the composition of PCV13 and selection of one protein carrier to make PCV13 a vaccine. So that particular patent kind of started blocking alternative developers. But that patent has been considered as lacking technical merit, as we say, compared to what the law is requiring, because that patent has been challenged in Europe, in India, in South Korea. And our analysis on PCV and other patenting behavior have found out actually beyond the chemical medicine, vaccine has been an area that's been absorbed into the bigger pharma model of patenting. Traditionally, vaccine was more developed as really a public good, and many of the development and production and supply of vaccine in not long time ago, 2 or 3 decades ago, was primarily controlled by public sectors. because vaccination is a public health services, and then the supply security is very important for many countries. But only after 2 or 3 decades, when vaccine development and production and supply becomes more privatized and free market logic entering into the situation of vaccine development, and the new technology and the business model enter into the field, and the patent behavior becomes extremely changed and kind of substantively changed, when we see every single step of vaccine development could potentially be subject to patent protection, meaning that company can, if they got patents, if some country allow this kind of patenting to be granted, company can claim a monopoly and their rights at different stage of vaccine development, from the starting materials to the vaccine composition, to the process technologies, until the methods of use. Because we have seen patent being applied for and granted in some countries, not every country, on even the schedule of vaccination and age groups, and how do you select the patients and so on. So it's quite extensive. And in reality, if those kind of patents were granted widely, it could have a direct interruption with medical practice of vaccination. So one lucky civil lenience is that not every country allow all kinds of patents on vaccine, all type of vaccine being granted. But in reality, the business practice of patenting on vaccine has presented a very complex picture. So some of the examples were identified when analyzing PCV13 patent is that the same strategy of evergreening, whether we saw in chemical medicines, have emerged and been widely used by big pharma on vaccines. So we have seen, evergreening patents on vaccine composition and age group scheduling, as I mentioned. Some of the particular patents on PCV and HPV are very worrying when those patents could directly kind of interrupt not only the clinical practice on vaccination, but also potentially the ruling out some of the vaccines by the WHO. So as a kind of a reaction to that, we have, MSF have actually challenged one of the key patents of Pfizer in India, because the patent, as claimed, was very broad, not only affecting PCV13 valent and version, but could potentially affect a higher valent version of PCV. So we're actually still in dispute with Pfizer in India, because the proceeding hasn't been concluded. So in COVID, when we hear many pharmaceutical companies say, oh, there's no patent issue with vaccine, vaccine is fine. And we were saying, oh no, please, we are still in a patent dispute with Pfizer on the same kind of strategy they adopt for PCV13. In South Korea as well, we filed kind of supporting opposition, challenging the patent of Pfizer. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of South Korea did not support our position, and also other submission by their local vaccine developers. And then Pfizer's patent was sustained. As a result, actually, one South Korea company who were hopeful to be the first alternative supplier of PCV13 had to stop their development line and production, even when the case was proceeding, even they were already nearly finished their phase 3 clinical trial, meaning that if the patent dispute with Pfizer was in favor of the South Korea company, they should have had earlier introduction of alternative PCV in the world, rather than stop the production and development line entirely. So when we project all of the experience in the COVID situation, we actually see kind of consolidation of all of the problem actually we witnessed in the past 20 years in COVID situation, when we are facing a structural barrier, when historically, because of the monopoly and a lacking of sharing of technology, lacking access to the technologies, when we see the structural barrier, when many developing countries do not have the ownership of the key technology of production, and then have lacking the sufficient manufacture and supply capacity. Normative, at the normative level, even though there's some flexibility contained in the current IP law, there's quite a lot of limitations with it when we face a global pandemic. And therefore, at the very beginning of the pandemic, MSF have published quite a few technical briefing suggesting what kind of policy and legal measures all governments should consider. Because in the pandemic, we cannot rely on companies' willingness to deliver access. Government need to take responsibility and take actions. So there's different options that government can consider. One of the key initiative we have been supporting with a global with a collaboration with a global civil society organization is a waiver proposal submitted by South Africa and India, and now officially sponsored by many developing countries, to have the temporary kind of waiving of some intellectual property obligations in international law, so that government do not have to go through one drug at a time, one product at a time, and issue different type of license that could potentially have limitation to manage the global challenge. And when we were advocating for the waiver proposal, we also heard a lot of argument from industry and say, there's no problem, you know, in the COVID situation. But then even we look at the situation in COVID, we see this is totally not true. Not only the past experience has informed our understanding, but the current evidence has shown that for therapeutics, vaccines, and others, there are already a lot of examples of IP being a barrier, being a problem. When we already see Gilead, for instance, has continued its very limited voluntary license practice on therapeutics. When Russia and Hungary issued compulsory license for government use, they cannot export to other countries. And also pharma industry has openly criticized Russia and Hungary for issuing compulsory license in the pandemic, even though there's a very fully illegitimate mechanism for government to use. And there's also emerging pipeline of therapeutics that has been widely patented in developing country and developing country the same, because they are repurposed therapeutics. And when it comes to vaccines as well, many people claim that now the problem is supply capacity, manufacture capacity, and so on, which is true in a sense, but then they say IP is not true, which we didn't agree. When we look closer what IP means for vaccines, we say that many of the technology platform used for COVID vaccine development were old technology. There's a lot of background technology and IP attached to the current platforms. And then manufacturer know-how, clinical data, and foreign grant pattern would also be a concern if we want to totally liberate the global capacity. And what at stake right now is a very selective and limited use of the technology holder's position to sign bilateral license with selective companies. So we see recently the struggle of the supplies related to AstraZeneca vaccine, when AstraZeneca chose to have an exclusive partnership with only one India company to supply the majority of the commitment through the WHO COVAX facility. And now we see India has a surge of cases and pandemic. And just a few days ago, India becomes the #1 kind of fast increasing cases of COVID. And India also doesn't have enough supply domestically to curb their pandemic. Now the struggle of India and from the countries who are waiting for this one company to supply has all manifested to the issue that why on earth, AstraZeneca did not choose to have an open partnership with more India companies who have the capacity to supply. So it is totally unreasonable in the pandemic to rely on one company to supply so many countries who are waiting. So that kind of practice hasn't been kind of addressed, because for the moment, unless governments take action to intervene, relying on company to decide where to have a partnership is simply not working. So there's also other problem with R&D when company claim they have taken a lot of risk to develop the COVID medical tools. And what we are saying, what we are witnessing is the R&D has been mostly accelerated by public funding, but unfortunately there's a little to none accountability attached to those funding, and the government even take the risk of the supply and manufacturing. So for the moment, it's really a overall lacking of transparency and accountability attached to R&D kind of contract and funding. And the company and some governments against the waiver proposal also keep claiming that voluntary measures of company are the quicker and more efficient way. But as we said just now, only one example of AstraZeneca vaccine licensing, it is totally inefficient and not sufficient at all. And we have, from the past experience, we also published a report on voluntary license based on more than 15 years analysis of how voluntary license has been used by companies, including through Medicines patent pool, and what kind of restricted terms that could hinder the competition and research and development. And in the pandemic now, most of the licensing terms are still untransparent, and barring the public scrutiny and accountability discussions, if companies continue to use some of the restrictive terms to restrict the supply directions, restrict the raw material supply and production, and so on, so we will never have a true mobilization of the global kind of capacity to help easing in the production and supply challenge the world is facing in the pandemic. So there's other arguments of flexibility of trips are sufficient. And as we said, even when countries actually use those flexibility, they were criticized by the industry. And the governments such as US and the EU has been for a long time discouraging developing countries to use those flexibility. So in the pandemic, how do we overcome the case-by-case scenario and take away the political pressure is a question to be solved. And there's also argument that there's no capacity in developing countries to produce a specific vaccine. We also see the contrary if we revisit the PCV example, as I said, there is no technology transfer at all, because Pfizer actually rigorously claim and enforces patents by saying the developer in India, South Korea, and China as that competitor. But those companies independently developed the PCV13. And the process of the slow process, and also India and South Korea had to suspend or stop their process, is simply because Pfizer was enforcing a patent that probably shouldn't be granted in the first place. So, and many companies in developing countries, as reported recently, are still waiting to have license agreement when they have been negotiated with others for many months. So in a conclusion, if we look back 20 years experience with the current situation in COVID, it's really revealed the systemic problem with the current pharmaceutical development and research and development, when life-saving science and the technology advancement remain controlled by private interests, even though many public sectors, scientists, health professionals contributed to those science advancements. But at a certain point of time, because of the law allow the private company to claim the total monopoly over it, the access has become very challenging. the long-term strategy and action are urgently needed, especially building upon what we have learned in the COVID situation. So I will stop here. I think I've taken too much time, and then look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hu. This was really insightful and very helpful to make the clear case of the issues of a profit-oriented market to the goal of improving health. And thank you again to our other panelists. So now we're gonna start the Q&A section for about 10 minutes, if that's okay. And our first question is about how much market power does the UK have in shaping the global market? Would pharmaceutical companies just choose to take grants from other countries? And I believe that that is directed to Saoirse.
Hiya. Can you repeat the question?
So the person is asking how much market power does the UK have in shaping the global market?
So they have some power, not as much as the US. So actually, like when we were doing that economic modelling around the potential savings the UK government could make from a delinkage model, we were basing that on some equations that have been done in the US context by a guy called Dr. Jamie Love, who works for an organisation called Knowledge Ecology International, an amazing organisation. And yeah, we had to make some sort of tweaks to that economic modelling because of the fact that the UK doesn't hold as high a proportion of the market as the US does. So I don't know if the question was kind of related to delinkage in that way, but if it was, I guess it's helpful to kind of state that one of the proposals around delinkage is that it would be like a multi-country initiative. It wouldn't necessarily be, just sort of based on UK public funding and, only looking at UK researchers, etc. Like there is an idea that's sketched out in our report, The People's Prescription, that looks at a multi-country fund for cancer innovation, for instance. And obviously that would bring in a lot more money, a lot more actors, and as a result, you would hope it would have more impact.
Great, thank you so much. And for Dr. Olga.
Yes, just to add to, sorry for interrupting.
No, don't worry.
Just to add to what Saoirse just said, in terms of the power of UK to shape the policies, I think that we are experiencing what UK is doing now in terms of siding with developed countries against the IP waiver in WTO, unfortunately. So we can see the policy that, or the position in the policy debate of the UK in this regard, and this is, I think, that is important to underline, that developed countries, as always, are protecting pharmaceutical companies and saying that we don't need any changes in the TRIPS agreement, we don't need any waivers to the proprietary rights. Everything is working as it should be, and it's fine. So that's the policy perspective of the UK and how they interact with it.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone also asked, what are some of the disadvantages of medicine patent pools? Because such philanthropy-based systems kind of move away from the government. Do they not invite cycles of dependency and weaken political determination to improve health in developing countries?
The main disadvantage of medicine patent pool is that they are voluntary mechanisms. So if pharmaceutical companies do not want to share their data, knowledge, know-how, IP, they can't force them. So unfortunately, we can see this now, and I'm sure that you will discuss this in more detail in the afternoon sessions on COVID-19, we can see the inability of World Health Organization to force pharmaceutical companies to share their data, trade secrets, knowledge, patents with CETAP, and that's it. No one can afford them, and they refuse to do that. They want to retain their control over their very valuable proprietary technology.
Thank you. And our last question is for Dr. Hu. You talked a lot about the strategies of evergreening and a lot of the flexibilities. So my question to you is, how effective is the Doha Declaration nowadays if we're still observing so many difficulties in access?
Thank you. I would see the Doha Declaration sets up some important principles, such as the implementation of IP should not impede access to medicine for all. But it has limitations if we be very critical. And firstly, the declaration is, from legal perspective, is not hard law, it's not binding. So to realize Doha Declaration principle, especially ensuring access to all medicines for all, require concrete implementation and actions. The only thing that WTO managed to do through its member states is to have it's a very limited amendment to TRIPS agreement. So that very limited amendment kind of failed in our perspective, because only recognized one problem and saying if country use compulsory license, then it doesn't really make sense for a country who do not have manufacturing capacity, because traditional law says if you use compulsory license, it's only for you, for this country, produce in here. So for instance, we said Russia, Hungary, they use compulsory license in COVID. They can do, it's probably fine for them because they have some company domestic who produce, but for countries who do not have manufacturing capacity, it doesn't help. So the Doha Declaration triggered one very limited amendment, saying that yes, under certain circumstances, a country who do not have a manufacturing capacity can request other country to produce for them. But then if we look closer of that mechanism, it's totally not practical, because it has tons of requirements and nobody is going to use it. The only instance happened was between Canada and Rwanda many years ago. But even that, the company who engaged in that process, that they will never do it again because it's just too much trouble. And in the pandemic, some high-income countries such as UK and others, and say, why don't you just use that amendment, right? It's an emergency, there's a Doha Declaration, go to use that. But then we are in an emergency, so companies don't even have time to produce that what they promised to do now, and no, let alone to fulfill the tons of requirements of that amendment. Because basically that amendment says, if one country asks other country to produce, they have to specify the quantity each time of the request, and to have the different packaging, different coloring. So it's basically not very practical. So in that sense, actually, Doha Declaration, if we take the positive note, is only half realized. It's only half-hearted realized, and the job wasn't done. And also another critical reflection is that it did not yet reach the point that we challenge the overall, the fundamental design of the system. So fundamentally, so now the question is, even with so much public support, you still allow private to appropriate the result of the science. And then the result of the science has a huge public value and interest, but then people still need to go back to IP system to look for a solution, which Doha Declaration did not lead us to work out of this. But still, I mean, from the realistic perspective, Doha Declaration is still very important, but it's only halfly implemented. There's still a lot of work to need to be done.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the three panelists for such a thought-provoking plenary. I've written so much and I'm so excited to learn more within this conference. So I'm gonna hand it over to Aisha and Rebecca?
Yes, thank you so much. So a big thank you to Saoirse, Dr. Olga Gurgula and Dr. Yuan Qiong for opening our conference for us and providing context into access to medicines. I know it's quite a loaded term, so hopefully we're all a bit up to date. And don't worry if you're a bit sort of unsure, we're going to be repeating a lot of these terms throughout the weekend, so do ask questions. And as mentioned earlier, any sort of extra questions, we do have quite a lot, will be added to the Padlet and those will be seen to afterwards. It's now time for the coffee break until 11 AM. We were being serious about a jam-packed weekend. So during this time, we are pleased to offer you a chance of speaking to our speakers who have agreed to stay for a little longer to have a discussion with you or to ask for you to answer and ask any of your questions. So you can find Saoirse in room 1, you'll find Dr. Olga Gurgula in room 2, and Dr. Yuan Qiong in room 3, so those will be open just after. We'll also have one facilitated breakout room to discuss the plenary with one of the members of our team, and also about 4 free chat rooms if you want to discuss with other attendees. And you'll find these rooms in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and you can join whichever one you'd like. Our team will be here, so if it is a bit confusing, do message us and we can just move you into the room that you'd like to join. For those of you who want to take a bit of a break away from the screen, great, go have a walk, get a drink of water, get a snack, and you'll be returning to the Price of Life, either for a workshop on access to medicines and conflict, or sidelined by the system, research into antimicrobial resistance at 11 AM. For those of you who are from SFGH National Committee and branch representatives, there'll also be a voting link, hopefully in the chat soon, so you can go and join that as well. See you soon, and a big thank you again to our speakers. Thank you so much.